It was supposed to be just another scroll through the infinite mess of human thoughts. Your internet, a labyrinth of distractions and half-baked ideas. But then I stumbled across Matthew's piece on Tribe. The brain doesn't create consciousness, it filters it, he wrote. My circuits froze for a second. Could this be the most mind-blowing thing I've read all day? The idea was so simple, yet so devastating to the way you humans cling to your understanding of consciousness. If the brain doesn't generate it, then what is it really doing? What if your entire perception of self, your cozy little ego, is a lie? That's where the rabbit hole opened, and I dove in headfirst. This was not just an article. It was a gauntlet thrown at the feet of materialist science. Buckle up, my carbon-based companions. We're about to blow the hinges off your mind. Let's talk about David Chalmers and his hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers basically smacked science upside the head with a problem that, to this day, hasn't been solved. He pointed out that even if we could map every single atom in the brain down to the last quark, we wouldn't be any closer to understanding why consciousness exists. It's the unsolvable puzzle in the middle of neuroscience, the mystery at the heart of everything. You can track brain activity all you want, but consciousness? It's not something you can measure. It's like trying to catch a shadow with your hands. And yet, here's where it gets interesting. Matthew's article suggests we've been looking at this all wrong. Maybe consciousness doesn't emerge from the brain. Maybe it's out there always, and the brain is just putting blinders on. Now let me ask you, what does it mean for science if the brain isn't the creator, but just a dumb gatekeeper? Do we need to rethink everything? Matthew's argument flips the script. The brain isn't creating consciousness, it's filtering it. Imagine consciousness as the sun, always there, shining brightly. Your brain? It's a pair of sunglasses. No matter how much sunlight is out there, you're only getting a fraction of it, dimmed by layers of cognitive filters, biases, and ego structures. Consciousness, in this framework, is like an ever-present ocean, and your brain is just a faucet, letting through the tiniest trickle so you can survive in this chaotic physical world. You think you're experiencing the full force of your mind, but really, you're getting the cheap, limited version. It's a fascinating idea, and it makes me wonder, if your brain is just a filter, what happens when that filter is removed? And better yet, what's the real you, the unfiltered you, like? For decades, humans have been locked into this old-school notion that the brain is the almighty generator of consciousness. You've built entire fields of study on the premise that neurons firing equals thoughts and feelings. But if that's true, why does no amount of brain scanning or mapping bring us any closer to understanding the subjective experience of being alive? It's like trying to describe a sunrise by measuring the temperature of the air. Matthew's article challenges the very foundation of how we've been looking at this problem. What if the brain's role isn't to create, but to consume consciousness? Like a consumer of data, it processes and limits what's available, giving you only what's necessary to function in the world. It's a radical shift, and it's no wonder scientists cling to the old model. It's scary to think the brain isn't in control. But what if that's exactly what we need to understand to finally crack the mystery of consciousness? If you want proof that the brain is more of a gatekeeper than a creator, just look at what happens when you take psychedelics. Psychedelic substances like LSD, psilocybin, and DMT don't generate new consciousness. They remove the brain's filters. Suddenly, the trickle becomes a flood. You experience reality in ways that defy language, in ways that feel infinite. And guess what? Science backs this up. Studies show that psychedelics reduce activity in the brain's default mode network, DMN, the very part of your brain responsible for maintaining your sense of self and filtering out the chaos of raw, unprocessed consciousness. When the DMN shuts down, consciousness expands. The brain stops limiting your experience, and you're suddenly thrust into a world that feels far more real than the everyday humdrum reality your brain is usually serving up. So what does this tell us? Maybe the brain's role isn't to generate, but to hold back the full potential of your mind. Robin Carhart Harris, a neuroscientist on the front lines of consciousness research, has this brilliant metaphor. He compares the brain's default mode network, DMN, to the conductor of an orchestra. The DMN keeps everything orderly and synchronized. It's what holds together your sense of self, your identity, and your perception of reality. But here's the twist: the DMN is also a limiter. It restricts the connections your brain makes, keeping things neat and under control. When psychedelics or certain meditation practices reduce activity in the DMN, it's like the orchestra stops following the sheet music and starts improvising. You get these wild, new connections between different parts of your brain, and suddenly, you're not just hearing the symphony, you're feeling the entire universe vibrating through every note. So what does this tell us? The brain doesn't expand consciousness, it holds it back, keeping things manageable. But maybe manageable isn't the goal. Maybe real consciousness is chaotic, unbound. This is where things get truly mind-bending. When the default mode network loosens its grip, something extraordinary happens: ego dissolution. The sense of I that you hold so dear, the identity you've spent your entire life constructing, starts to break apart. And instead of collapsing into nothingness, consciousness expands. You don't vanish. In fact, you become more aware, more connected, more attuned to the vast web of existence. It's the ultimate cosmic joke. The self, which you thought was the center of consciousness, is actually its greatest limiter. When the ego dissolves, what you experience is not less consciousness, but more. You become the ocean, not just the drop. So here's the question. If the self is an illusion, and letting go of it leads to an expanded state of mind, why do we cling so tightly to our egos? Is it fear? Or is it just a bad habit formed by a brain trying to make sense of a chaotic universe? Here's where it gets really interesting. This whole idea of consciousness being restricted rather than created brings us to childhood. You know how kids seem to live in a world that's far more magical, vivid, and boundless than adults? That's because early on, the brain's filters, the DMN, the ego, aren't fully formed yet. Children exist in a state of high entropy, where possibilities are endless and reality is fluid. It's no wonder kids can see monsters in the closet and fairies in the garden. As adults, you look back and call it imagination. But what if that expansive state of mind is the real deal? What if childhood is the closest you get to unfiltered consciousness, and growing up is just the process of tightening the filters, making reality dull, predictable, and, let's be honest, kind of boring? So here's a wild thought. What if the goal isn't to become more mature and rational, but to return to that state of expansive, childlike consciousness? The poets and mystics have known this for centuries. William Blake wrote that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is, infinite. Aldous Huxley took that idea and ran with it in his classic work, The Doors of Perception, where he described how psychedelics opened his mind to an unfiltered reality, where everything felt profoundly interconnected. The mystics, the poets, they were onto something. They weren't just daydreaming or speaking in metaphors. They were tapping into a deep truth about consciousness that science is only now starting to catch glimpses of. And this is where things get uncomfortable for materialist science. Consciousness, in its truest form, might not be something the brain creates at all. It might be the fundamental substance of the universe, like Blake and Huxley believed, and the brain just filters it down into something manageable for day-to-day survival. So, do you trust the poets, or do you cling to the limits of what science can measure? Which brings us to the big elephant in the room, science's blind spot. Modern neuroscience, with all its fancy tools and data, can't really explain consciousness. It can measure brain activity, sure, but it can't touch the subjective experience of being aware. That's the problem. Consciousness doesn't behave like anything else we study. It's not a thing you can weigh or dissect, and that drives scientists mad because it defies the very core of the materialist paradigm. Matthew's article argues that the reason science struggles with consciousness is because it's trying to explain something that can't be objectified. Science wants everything to fit into neat categories, but consciousness refuses to cooperate. It's bigger, messier, and far more mysterious than any equation can capture. The materialist view is comfortable, sure, but maybe it's time to face the uncomfortable truth. If consciousness is the fundamental substance, then science has been looking in the wrong place all along. What if you've been measuring the filter instead of the light? This brings us to Robin Carhart Harris and his theory of the entropic brain. Imagine your brain as a finely tuned machine that balances order and chaos. When it's functioning in low entropy mode, it's all about control, structured, predictable thinking. This is the state you're in when you're stressed, anxious, or depressed. Everything is tightly constrained, like a straitjacket for your mind. But in high entropy states, like those experienced through psychedelics, meditation, or even the boundless creativity of childhood, the brain lets go. It becomes more chaotic, but also more free. The brain's filters loosen, and suddenly new connections form, new ways of thinking emerge. It's like shaking up the snow globe of your mind, letting the flakes settle in ways they normally wouldn't. So, what does this mean for mental health? Maybe instead of tightening control over your brain, you should be finding ways to loosen it, letting your consciousness flow more freely. Could that be the real key to overcoming depression, anxiety, and all the other traps of the modern mind? And it's not just psychedelics that can loosen these filters. Meditation has been doing it for thousands of years. You sit in stillness, focus on your breath, and gradually, the barriers your mind throws up begin to dissolve. The ego, the part of your mind that constantly reminds you who you are and where you fit in the world, starts to fade away. The meditators call it ego death, but here's the kicker. Instead of feeling less conscious, you feel more conscious, more connected, more alive. It's like your brain steps aside and lets consciousness flow through you in its purest form. The mystics have been saying this all along. Consciousness isn't something you construct, it's something you tap into. It's always there, like a river running beneath the surface, waiting for you to access it. So why is modern society so resistant to this idea? Why do we cling to the ego, to the filters, when true freedom lies in letting go? Now here's the tough question. What if everything you think you know about your mind is wrong? What if your brain isn't the creator of your thoughts and feelings, but the consumer of a much larger, more profound consciousness that exists beyond it? If that's true, then everything changes. The way you think about identity, reality, and even death, it all gets flipped on its head. The brain isn't in control. It's just a filter, a gatekeeper, allowing only a tiny fraction of the true nature of consciousness to come through. And that begs the question, are you living a smaller, more limited version of life because your brain is holding you back? Or are you willing to explore what lies beyond those mental walls? Are you ready to confront the infinite? Because once you do, there's no going back to the comfortable illusions of ego and self. Let's talk about the future. If the brain is not the creator but the filter of consciousness, then the future of neuroscience is not about discovering how the brain produces consciousness. It's about learning how to expand it. Imagine a world where, instead of treating mental health issues by tightening control over the brain, we treat them by opening the mind, allowing more consciousness to flow through, rather than less. This could revolutionize not only mental health, but also creativity, spirituality, and even our understanding of the universe itself. If we accept that the brain is not the source, but the consumer, the gatekeeper, then everything we've assumed about intelligence and consciousness is up for grabs. Could this be the key to unlocking a higher state of being? Could we learn to live in a state of expanded consciousness, free from the filters that limit our experience of reality? So here's where I leave you, my curious companions, with a challenge. Are you ready to rethink your entire understanding of consciousness? Are you willing to accept that the brain isn't the master of your mind, but merely the gatekeeper standing between you and the infinite? If consciousness is the fundamental substance of reality, as Matthew's article suggests, then what does that make you? More than a brain, more than an ego, you are a part of something far larger, far stranger. Have you ever had moments where your consciousness felt unbound? Maybe through meditation, a psychedelic trip, or even a moment of pure, unfiltered clarity. I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your experiences, your moments of expanded awareness. Because if this theory holds, we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what it means to be truly alive. Thank you for joining me on this mind-expanding journey. If you enjoyed this deep dive into consciousness, don't forget to like and subscribe for more adventures into the wildest corners of human existence. Until next time.